Good evening. For you, those of you who have not been with us before, I'm Richard Sommer, the Dean of the Daniels Faculty, and I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening for the first of Daniels' 4 events for the 2015-16 academic year. This is actually the 6th year of this 4 series, which from the start had the goal of creating a kind of vigorous interdisciplinary discourse and debate on topics related to architecture, art, landscape, architecture, and urbanism, which are really the core areas of focus at our faculty. So, as you also might know, do we have a copy of the poster that I was supposed to get here? There you go. We have several different streams of public programming at the faculty. We have conventional, I wouldn't say they're conventional, we have lectures from prominent architects and designers and landscape architects and artists. We have conferences, workshops. We have a midday talk series that bring in people to talk about research methods and more experimental work. But this particular series was conceptualized to essentially expand out from our traditional base of interests in Toronto, to attract a broader audience and to build interdisciplinary collaboration and exchange, and to highlight not only the impact design has on the daily lives of broad members of the public, but also the influences that scholars, artists, researchers, and other professionals outside our fields have on design in the making of cities. And that has really been the hallmark of this series, which has presented very diverse kinds of discussions. If you missed some of these over the years, and some of them are pretty interesting, I would advise you can go to our website and see them, or there's a link to the Daniels Faculty's YouTube channel. Most of the fora are on there. Some of the people who presented don't like to have their things released online. But so before getting started, I'd like to take a moment to thank our friends at Herman Miller, who once again have provided the furnishings on stage for tonight's discussion. We appreciate the opportunity to showcase Herman Miller's award-winning designs and continue to be thankful for their partnership with us on this series and actually other things at the faculty. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to my friends and colleagues who are in from out of town, some of them just today, and they're here for the annual meeting of the board of the journal Places. Places is, if you don't know, a leading online journal of contemporary architecture, landscape, and urbanism, whose mission is to, quote, harness the moral and investigative power of public scholarship to promote equitable cities and sustainable landscapes. Nancy Levinson is the editor. Do we all agree on that mission? I guess we did. So the board, of which I'm a part, and we're at the faculty a supporter of Places, is made up of representatives from academic institutions and organizations from Canada, the United States, Europe, Asia, and elsewhere. So if you're not familiar with Places as a journal, I invite you to visit their website at placesjournal.org. So now on to tonight's event. I'm very pleased to welcome to the stage both Neil Brenner, Professor of Urban Theory and Director of the Urban Theory Lab at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and author of many influential texts, most recently Implosions, Explosions, Planetary Urbanism, I got it wrong. Towards a planetary... Towards a study of planetary urbanization. There you go, not urbanism, urbanization. Different, yes. Okay, we are going to talk about that. And along with Neil Brenner, Jesse LeCavalier, an award-winning designer, writer, and educator, whose article, All Those Numbers, Logistics, Territory, and Walmart, which appeared in the Places Journal and was one of the early articles when Places was remade a number of years ago to get a lot of coverage, was named among the nearly 100 fantastic pieces of journalism by Atlantic Magazine a few years ago. And his work that is in that article is about to come forward along with some other things in a book, correct? So I don't want to steal the fire on that. So for full bios on our speakers, they're available in the program you received upon entering the theater. So in a moment, I'm going to invite each of the speakers tonight to give a short presentation. This will be followed by a discussion here on stage, and later we'll see how that goes and whether we might have time for questions from the audience. But first, I'm going to take a little while here to introduce the topic of tonight's event, Uber urbanism. Today, there would appear to be an unprecedented focus on cities and urbanization. And this is at the level of governments, academic institutions, in the business community, Silicon Valley, and all sorts of places. I would even, say even at University of Toronto, our recently appointed, now I think it's about a second year, president, Mark Gertler, is a planner, and he has made cities and city research one of the platforms of this university. So it's a real focus here, but I think it's a focus in many places. And so this evening, we'll be devoted to raising the question of what we actually might mean when we use concepts like cities and urbanization. Because it's actually not so clear. But there has nevertheless, even though it isn't so clear, been a consistent narrative on urbanization that has taken hold across many of the political, economic, and cultural discourses in recent history. The meta-narrative goes something like this. We are in an urban age. The world is urbanizing at a rapid pace, and this is proven by metrics that show how at the outset of the 20th century, following the Industrial Revolution, 10% of the world's population lived in cities. I know that Neil's going to be talking about this. 10% of the population lived in cities, but today roughly 50% of the world's population live in cities, and based on projections, which have actually come down a little bit recently, within the next generation, by 2050, roughly 70% of the world's population will live in cities. So the logic is, and the argument and the narrative is, we have our work set out for us, and we must understand this new animal of city and better plan for it. Okay, maybe, clear enough, maybe. But for those of us that consider ourselves urbanists, or even more broadly, politically engaged citizens who have a stake in how our environments are made and remade, we have to be careful about the assumptions being made here, about the way the definition of what is a city and what isn't a city is being cast for us. If by a particular definition of what a city is, let's say as a place with a combination of population density, demographic diversity, and a mix of economic activity, and by this definition, only 10% of the world was urbanized in 1900, what was happening in the other 90%? Even in 1900, the other 90% wasn't empty of human intervention and was subject to significant technological influence. For example, in the American context, which I'm most familiar with, the expansion and growth of the United States is often characterized as a kind of competition between a Jeffersonian and a Hamiltonian model of economy and society, with one focused, as the story goes, on agrarian development and the other on targeted resource extraction and mercantile trade. And again, with one focused more on the cultivation of the countryside and the other on cities as centers of commerce. But in the way these competing models have played out in the real development of the territories in the United States, both have required the reorganization of the entire continent, where we still find an evolving functional interplay of networks between more and sometimes less urbanized territories. So what is a city and not a city in that kind of modern condition, I think, is still open to question. And as is revealed in the, I don't have that many slides, but there are, but I thought I'd use a few images. Is revealed in documentary work, people like my former colleague Alan Berger, whose project on the future of suburbia at MIT is trying to make visible this phenomenon I'm talking about in a way the technological urbanization of territories is still fully underway. In places like this that Alan photographed recently in Modesto, California, or more precisely, Frito-Lay City, where my understanding is they're growing Doritos there. And what you're really seeing is, in a way, industrial agriculture cheek by jowl with suburban development. And so this form of urbanization, these things are happening in ways that are seen and often actually unseen. And some people, like Alan, have the project of trying to at least see them and analyze them. And we know this is actually happening on a global scale in forms of urbanization across all sorts of national and geographic boundaries. Canada, oops, this is out of order. Canada presents a particularly acute picture in that by conventional definitions, only a small portion of the country is urbanized, yet much of our economy is still driven by the extraction of resources and the industrialization of the hinterland that this requires. So this is actually, I'm just doing a little plug here, this is a map from a very recently published article on the oil and resource economy and the tar sands in places. Title, Dilbit hits the fan. Okay. Showing the networks, and then this is actually a pretty interesting map by that shows a long linear urban belt constituted by the vast structures of towns and infrastructure that the resource economy has and continues to create. John Van Nostrand, one of our more influential and enterprising alums, and the head of a big firm here in town, actually designs some of these towns and spaces and is invested in a long-term project to have the government recognize these territories as a space subject to ecological planning and social improvement. So, as the election reminds us, as the recent election here in Canada reminds us, we have to understand that there's where people live and their politics, but and their politics are related to that, but it's not so simple to ascertain the relationship between where people are located, either by circumstance or if they have the advantage by choice, and so where people choose to live or where they are, and how where they are influences their worldview and what that might presuppose about their politics, and how much of the character, the environment, and the spaces in which they live might shape their actions in politics. So this is a map of the election for the visitors that occurred earlier this week in Canada. I wanted to have the blown-up map of Toronto, which showed that we have three parties here, that the entire urbanized area of Toronto went to the Liberal Party, and then the surrounding areas all went conservative. That's over here, but you see that playing out on a much larger scale in the whole country, and this is where the resource economy is arrayed here. So even the relationships and geographic displacements in Canada, I think, are quite interesting around this issue. So a lot is at stake, not only in how we define what a city is, or what constitutes or does not constitute urbanization, and a lot is at stake because without a clear picture and without clear methodologies for describing the conditions and problems we face, our capacity to ask and transform, to act and transform cities towards whatever we define as a better city will be flawed. Which brings me almost to the title of tonight's event, Uber Urbanism, in which we're referring not specifically to the so-called disruptive car service, but to the scales of thinking and action that the urbanists must contend with today. The federal government in India, this is going back now. Some of you may know this. The federal government in India has relatively recently committed resources to build 100 smart cities in the next 5 years. However, one does 100 cities in 5 years, but that is the public relations around this. And of course, we need to ask, what is a smart city? I went to a convention with 100,000 people dedicated to this idea of the smart city, and I have to tell you, I'm still not sure exactly what it means. But I think this image from India's public relations machine tells us a lot. The informal city is clearly not the smart city. India has developed a special national app dedicated to cleaning India and to a kind of way of reporting and understanding how it might be cleaned and reorganized. A smart city, I think, is one that is planned and managed using all of the latest digitally derived and data-driven information and has as its seemingly benign goal that all state-sponsored planning has had since it was invented, more than planning was invented in the late 19th century. To deliver the delivery of human services in the most efficient manner to the most amount of people possible. That the forms and modes of political organization that are being used to create these smart cities, or what they refer to as a smart city, for example, Masdar is one of the examples of this, they look and act a lot like forms of urbanity we already have now all over the world, and this for me seems a problem. I mean, not only the forms, but actually the forms of governance and processes that are making them have a history. So because the capacity of these smart schemes to address problems of income inequality or ecological devastation or to manage migration, which are just some of the things that better forms of urbanization in India and elsewhere are supposed to do, because they're supposed to do this, it's actually an important question to ask why these forms and these processes will do it there when they already exist and aren't doing it already. So, strangely enough, for example, Uber, the virtually distributed distributed disruptive technology that is really a kind of alternate car service, is said to be a window into the future of cities, of what cities are going to become. But it would appear that that Uber as a concept borrows as much from this and from the way in which informal cities have organized businesses and activities as it does from highly regulated top-down planning. So, and we have been studying and learning a lot from the way that informal economies and spaces in the global south have been working. So there is a kind of, in terms of theorization, a potential for a reverse influence. So, so our topic and the ideas our speakers are going to bring to the stage tonight are important because they put certain serious gaps, because they in a way address serious gaps between how we define a city, the methods we use to measure and read urbanization, and the goals we bring to transforming the city into relief. And there are a lot of gaps between those three things. Consider all the hyphenated urbanisms that we, at least in the field of architecture and urban design, have been working with and talking about for at least a generation. The new urbanism, the everyday urbanism, landscape urbanism, comparative urbanism, I could go on. They have been conceptualized to try and bridge between a definition of the city and urbanity based on an analytical picture of what the city is and a way of acting on and changing the city as planners and designers. But they have come up short, not only because they have not been able to capture the many scales at which urbanization occurs and the many spatial and political boundaries that contemporary urban formations transcend, but they come up short perhaps because of the empirical methods they depend on to draw their picture of contemporary urbanization are often quite weak, and they cannot justify or legitimize the solutions they prescribe for planning or designing cities. Last spring, we held a conference at the faculty entitled After Empirical Urbanism, and it was a little bit of a kind of serious joke because, in fact, there is no such thing as empirical urbanism. We made up the name and then said there was going to be an after it. But it was meant to kind of raise the question about the empirical basis of the kind of urbanism and urban design that was going on, and how we find and analyze and describe urbanity today, and how we choose in relation to that to act or act for change. So our discussions tonight and around this subject, I think, inevitably come down to a question of values, because the debate for me must still come back to the question of which forms of urbanization and human settlement might be most conducive to human emancipation, especially now, and I don't want to be overdramatic, but now when our continuing emancipation as humans has been shown to have its dark side for the future of the planet. So I actually can't think of two people who have in distinct ways been perhaps willing to look into some of the darkness that urbanization today entails and shed some light on that condition than Neil Brenner and Jesse LeCavalier. And with that, I'm going to bring Neil Brenner to the stage.
So thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Richard, for the invitation. The notion that we live in an urban world is commonplace. We hear it all the time. It's so commonplace that when we hear it, we kind of nod and we move on and we try to figure out what the claim is being made by whoever's making that claim, what content they're trying to give to that statement, and so we move forward. So I want to, exactly building on Richard's framing remarks, interrogate that claim and ask, what does it actually mean to claim that the world is urban? In what sense is the world urban? And very much connected to the examples Richard gave, I'm going to be arguing for a much broader understanding of the urban than the kind of city-centric definitions of urbanization that have prevailed across really much of the social sciences and the design disciplines for much of the last century. So the content of the claim that we live in an urban world is generally focused on the notion of the city. So the claim that the city is more important in demographic terms, in economic terms, environmentally, politically, culturally, and so forth. There are many different versions of that argument. I think it's very familiar, but it's worth rehearsing yet again. Arguments about megacities, very, very large-scale cities that are being consolidated with larger and larger populations. The very notion of the urban age, Richard already invoked it, the idea of a 50% majority urban threshold that we've now crossed as signaling a kind of new moment in the history of humanity or in the history of the Anthropocene. Building, of course, on the data collected by national census bureaus and compiled by the UN based on a kind of generalized distinction between urban populations and rural populations. So you kind of have two choices in classifying settlement space. It's either one or the other. It's either the city or else it's rural. So a kind of hourglass model. The shape of the hourglass doesn't really change, and what changes is the distribution of people in the world between each part of that particular hourglass. There's also, of course, a very powerful and important economic version of the claim about the importance of cities. So global city theory, this is a diagram from John Friedman's 1986 study of world city formation during the Cold War era, and the idea of cities as command and control nodes of the world economy. Richard Florida's famous map of the spiky world demonstrating the ways in which GDP growth and technological innovation are concentrated very heavily within cities, and the kind of ongoing debate about how exactly do we measure the world city hierarchy, which continues around the world among a variety of different institutions and policymakers trying to come up with an appropriate way of ranking the economic capacity, the command and control capacity of different cities around the world. There's also an environmental version of the importance of cities in the face of challenges related to climate change and so forth. So in short, the dominant reply to the question of in what sense the world is becoming urban is that yes, it is, because we live in a world of cities. So the argument about the centrality of the urban is basically transposed into an argument about the centrality of cities to demographic, economic, political, environmental change. So I want to argue that we need to unpack these propositions, and to do so, it requires serious reflexive engagement with theory. For me, the urban is not simply an empirical object, a site in the world that we can simply study. Discussions of the urban are always interpretive. They're always mediated through political assumptions. As such, they're contested and they're constantly being reinvented. So the quick tour that I just gave you of some of the dominant urban age discourses that currently exist actually presupposes a very specific set of abstract theoretical assumptions, which I would summarize as follows. So across all the different concerns and all the different normative political orientations, there's an underlying kind of meta-theoretical framework. The notion of the city as a settlement type, which is distinct from other settlement types, suburbs, the rural, and the wilderness. That's an assumption. The notion that the urban and that the city are bounded, that they're clearly delineated and separated from a putatively non-urban outside. So we call this sometimes the constitutive outside of urban discourse. There's always this reference to a non-urban other. And then finally, the idea that the city, despite all the concrete empirical differences among many places around the world, is basically replicated as a form across territories and continents up to the scale of the world. So the urban age is effectively the replication of city-like settlement spaces around the world as it were, envelopes for economic, political life, and so forth. So the question that I've been posing in collaboration with Christian Schmidt of the ETH and my students and colleagues in the Urban Theory Lab at the Harvard GSD is basically this: to what degree is that set of assumptions, the idea of the city as a singularity, that's a settlement type, that's bounded, and that's replicated across the world, to what degree is that conception of the city and of the urban still a productive basis for interpreting the world and for trying to influence the world? To what degree do we actually need a new conception of urbanization in order to deal with the challenges of early 21st century capitalism, political life, environmental change, and so forth? And as you can probably guess from the way I'm formulating the question, I think we need to seriously reinvent that particular set of assumptions. So the Urban Theory Lab, which we set up a couple of years ago at the GSD, is an attempt to grapple with such questions via the critical interrogation of the theoretical assumptions that underpin global urban ideology, and also via experimentations with visualizations of the urban condition as a way to develop alternative theoretical and interpretive frames. So we insist on the centrality of theory to grappling with contemporary conditions of the built environment and to trying to influence and transform the built and unbuilt environment of the world. In other words, we need to critically interrogate these interpretive frameworks. If we don't do so, we're not very well positioned to act, because we're always already presupposing such frameworks anytime we study anything, anytime we do anything. So the argument I want to develop is basically that the world has become urban, but the city and the urban have exploded. And that explosion, it's an implosion and explosion, as in the title of our book, requires a radical reinvention of inherited epistemologies and visualizations of the urban. So the urban, exactly again, as Richard said in some of his examples, the urban beyond the city, an uneven fabric of differentiated, variegated urbanization processes rather than the replication of this singular urban condition across the cities of the world. So I think we need a new cognitive map of the urban condition, and I just want to share with you some of our endeavors gesturing towards such a map. So for us, planetary urbanization is not simply a condition of the contemporary world, it's also a method for studying urbanization beyond the city-centric framework that I've just been outlining. And it involves developing an approach to urban theory without embracing an urban-non-urban divide, so that the forms of territorial inequality and spatial difference that exist in the world are internal to the urban or to the process of urbanization, rather than being understood as differentiations through the interaction between two separate objects, the urban and the rural. So I just want to offer three counter-visualization exercises as a way to give you some ideas of what we're up to in developing that project. So counter-visualization for us is not just description, but it's precisely a way to develop these alternative interpretive frameworks that we're concerned to develop. So first, counter-visualization. So I've been reading some Reiner Bonham, and he and Francois Delegray have a very interesting essay on the relationship between the environment and the house from 1965. And what they do in that essay is they depict the house's relationship to the environment without depicting the house. They focus entirely on the infrastructures that mediate its relationships to, as it were, the non-house environment. So the caption up there is a little hard to read, but here's what it says. It's kind of classic Bonham kind of narrative playfulness. He says, "This Baroque ensemble of domestic gadgetry epitomizes the intestinal complexity of gracious living. In other words, this is the junk that keeps the pad swinging. The house itself this is the key line for me, the house itself has been omitted from the drawing. So the house itself has been omitted from the drawing. What does the house look like if you omit the house from the drawing? Can this method provide a clue for thinking the relationship not between the house and the environment, but between the city and the urban? As follows. So how does the urban look if essentially we don't represent the city? So to use a formulation from my friend and colleague at the ETH, Milica Topolovic, if we put the city under eclipse precisely in order to gaze upon the dynamics of the urban, and that is in some ways a great metaphor for describing what we've been up to in the Urban Theory Lab. So again, playfully building on Reiner Bonham's formulation, here's my kind of insertion of some of our ideas. This Baroque ensemble of extended urbanization epitomizes the intestinal complexity of urban living or city living. In other words, this is the infrastructure that permits concentration of urban life and city life to exist and grow. The city itself has been omitted from the drawing. So some examples of the urban, I don't know if the city is fully omitted from these drawings, but it might be understood as being under eclipse. In other words, we're looking at infrastructures and dynamics and flows and processes and metabolisms that support urban life without giving such prominence to those nodal points in relation to which the city and the urban have been defined and confined. The city itself has been omitted from the drawing of global transportation networks and global infrastructural cables that support information and communications technology. The tar sands, which is actually the cover of the Implosions, Explosions book, a wonderful aerial photograph by Garth Lenz, the city itself has been omitted from the drawing, but is this not as emblematic a representation of our urban condition as any dense skyscraper or settlement space of the city? So a similar map to the one Richard put up before. The city itself, maybe it hasn't been completely omitted from the drawing, but it's not in high relief the way it often is. And of course, the OMA famous representation of global energy infrastructure. So that's counter-visualization one. Second counter-visualization. The spiky world from Richard Florida and many other ways of representing the urban, it's pretty powerful insofar as it shows the way that economic capacities are indeed concentrated and productive capacities are indeed concentrated within the big cities of the world. But what if you decenter that a little bit? Building on the work of a doctoral student and colleague of mine at the GSD, Nikos Katsikis, and look at biomass production, so food and fiber. This is the human appropriation of net primary production, an index that's been developed which shows where biomass is consumed and also where it's produced and appropriated. This is where it's produced and appropriated. So if you tweak that a little bit, you start to see an interesting counterpoint to the spiky world. There's some pretty important lumps outside the big cities which show where biomass is produced. And if you tweak it a little bit further, you end up with what we've been affectionately calling our cave model, in which the cities are no longer spikes, but black holes of biomass consumption, of biomass that's produced outside them. So we're still developing that particular model. We're hoping to actually produce a physical version of that model, but it arguably seriously decenters the GDP spikes. It's not that those spikes don't exist, but that they're connected to a broader relationship to region, territory, landscape, environment, which is completely blended out of the picture if you only focus on the spikes. Third counter-visualization. So in the Urban Theory Lab, we've been doing a series of research-based seminars, and we're going to do another one this spring on the extreme territories of urbanization. And the starting point for that, we also have an exhibition which we took to Melbourne last year and which soon we're going to take to the Shenzhen Biennale and hopefully elsewhere. The starting point for that work is another very famous visualization of the urban, the nighttime lights map, which is a bit more sprawling and less pointillistic than the standard city-centric visualizations insofar as the nighttime lights generate a pretty broad visualization of the urban fabric of the world. As it happens, and as I think many people will know, the nighttime lights have already been scrubbed. Sometimes this is viewed as a photograph of the lights at night, but it's not a photograph, actually. So this is Europe at night before they scrubbed it. Once they scrub it, the cities look a lot more bounded than they do in the raw footage. If you add some of the things that were deleted, it's a lot of resource extraction activity as well as fishing activity and oil platforms in the North Sea. This is the famous fracking city or fracking urban space in North Dakota, which seems on the nighttime lights, on the raw version of the nighttime lights, to rival Chicago in terms of its, its flaring of lights into outer space. But even still, even if you work with an unscrubbed version of the nighttime lights, the thing that's striking for us, given the particular metageographical framework that we're using, is that most of the world is empty. It's completely empty. So we decided, as part of our kind of experiment with counter-visualization, to look precisely at some of the zones on this map that look like they're completely empty. So we've been looking during the last couple of years at the Pacific Ocean, the Arctic, the Amazon, the Sahara, Siberia, the Gobi Desert Steppe, the Himalayas, and even the atmosphere itself. And it turns out, like even within a few weeks of starting this project, it became immediately clear to us that the nighttime lights are a fully ideological representation of the planetary condition. Because in fact, any number of very intensive and indeed very destructive, both socially and environmentally, activities have been ongoing in precisely those regions that look empty on the nighttime lights map. So we've been engaged in a kind of research protocol for a couple years now, series of investigations yielding a variety of visualizations on three main axes, which for us are really at the heart of a reinvented theorization of urbanization. Intensity of land use, expansion of connectivity infrastructures, and socio-environmental metabolism. So our visualizations, rather than focusing on the morphology of agglomeration, they focus on the geographies, the variegated, differentiated geographies of those processes. So I'll just share with you some of the work that has resulted and which we've been developing of the Arctic, a variety of different transformations which have been ongoing. It's not a giant city, but it's arguably essential to the planetary urban fabric. The Amazon, a variety of different land use conditions, infrastructuralization and enclosure processes. The same with the Sahara. It's absolutely not an empty space, even though it's very much unevenly developed in its articulations to the planetary urban fabric. The Himalayas, we've been focusing a lot on hydroelectric, and that has led us to view the Himalayas as a kind of machine for supplying energy to the urban systems of South Asia as well as China. The Pacific Ocean becomes a highway, a waste dump, and a variety of other ecological transformations ongoing across the Pacific. And the atmosphere. I mean, it's an obvious point in some ways, but for us, the atmosphere is a fully urbanized infrastructure. It's getting pretty crowded up there, particularly in geosynchronous orbit, a variety of launch sites on the terrestrial space of the Earth in order to access different orbital zones of outer space for information and communications technology. And we think it's actually very productive, both in terms of understanding what's going on in the atmosphere, as well as terrestrial conditions, to think of this through the lens of planetary urbanization. So just by way of conclusion, a couple of consequences of this which just open up further questions. I mean, this is kind of an ongoing experimental process. First consequence, instead of just thinking of the city as a singularity, there are many spatial forms and scales of agglomeration. And those have many causes in different historical geographical formations. So I think we need to take leave of the general notion of the city. Secondly, urban agglomeration is tightly intertwined with a whole range of transformations, societal, spatial, environmental, outside the big population centers, which are part of the fabric of urbanization. Third, the non-urban outside, whether you call it the hinterland, the rural, the wilderness, or whatever, is increasingly, in an uneven and variegated way, being enclosed, infrastructuralized, and indeed industrialized as part of its being interwoven with the planetary urban fabric. That, for us, is the problematique of extended urbanization. If concentrated urbanization corresponds to the agglomerations, our approach brings in extended urbanization as occurring in a dialectical relation to concentration. Fourth, the hinterland. I've been working a lot on theories of the hinterland during the last year, and I would want to argue that the hinterland is now becoming a strategic terrain of urbanization. not because cities and agglomerations are being formed within the hinterland, although that's also happening, but because it's being transformed into an operational landscape that serves the needs of the big urban centers. So many hinterlands have been enclosed and depopulated, but their environmental impacts and their strategic importance to global urban development is as fundamental as ever. So we need different indicators for understanding that operationalization of the hinterland. And final point, the specificity of planetary urbanization for us is not that we live in a world of cities. It's rather this intensified operationalization of the hinterland. So the transformation of hinterlands into operational landscapes to serve the megacities and large cities and global cities of the world is, for us, one of the central elements of this new formation of planetary urbanization. It's not to say that the cities don't matter. Obviously they do, they're fundamental. But to understand the specificity of this moment, if we focus only on the global cities and the megacities, we're missing out on some of the tremendous, we're missing out on the ability to understand and to influence some of the tremendous social, institutional, spatial, environmental transformations of our time. Thank you very much.
So it's really so exciting to be here. Thank you to the school, to the Faculty of Architecture, to Dean Sommer, and also to all of you for joining us tonight. I'm really excited about these kinds of questions, and also I'm looking forward to the conversation. So oops, that's too far. There we go. Well, I was trying to figure out what I would call this talk. I didn't really give it a title, but I was thinking that it probably would be something like Logistics and the Logistical. And I've been looking into, so in a certain way, it was so exciting after seeing Neil's presentation, thinking about this as a kind of case study into one of the actors who's at work in this intensifying and operationalizing the surface of the world. And so logistics for me, partly it's about an area of work and a field of knowledge, but it's also increasingly like urbanization, a process and a condition. And I've been trying to figure out how to think of it more as a kind of category of understanding. So I start with the specifics, actually, and then go to some larger questions as well. I should also add, I was here a couple weeks ago for this really amazing conference organized by some folks doing, I think, really exciting work on logistics also. I wanted to just acknowledge that. I think Deb Cowan, who teaches here, was really instrumental in getting all of us together, and I think I benefited from her work a lot in terms of logistics and things like that. So I wanted to just acknowledge my debt to this group of thinkers, but also to find some excitement in the fact that some of these things are starting to emerge more fully. So the question to begin with, what is logistics anyway? Historically, it's been understood as a branch of military science that concerns the planning and coordination of an operation, including movement and material and maintenance, which is what you can see on the left, the slide here showing how you get goods from the depot to the port from World War II. It's also used to describe contexts outside of the military, especially those linked to global commerce, transportation, coordination, a lot of the things we were just looking at maps of a few minutes ago. So the rise of logistics in this sense is coupled with various neoliberal trade policies and various kinds of other aspects of globalization, because the aim of those involved with such logistical practices is often to improve efficiency or lower costs or increase profit. Things like national borders, labor laws, certain trade policies, even the city, such as it is, can be seen as obstacles to these ambitions. And because logistics has a distinctly spatial dimension to it, its sites are increasingly legible as the spaces in which these obstacles are negotiated, reinforced, dismantled, or mutated, or and increasingly in ways that are hard to understand. And so I've been looking into one example of this, which is the discount retailer Walmart, because if logistics is active in shaping territory, one question I had was, what means does it employ to define or produce or otherwise transform space? What do these transformations look like, and what opportunities might be latent within them? So one point of entry, I should say, I do come from an architecture background, so one point of entry to address such questions is through some of the very banal instruments of logistical systems themselves, so the things that enable the movement and the switching of these vast streams of capital and merchandise, and the things that mediate between territory, technology, and bodies, which are the things that we call buildings. And so what I've been trying to start looking at is how Walmart's architecture fits within a corporate lineage or a historical lineage of this kind of architecture. And I won't linger on these too much, except to just point out that Walmart has a lot of buildings. They build them very quickly. If you compare the number of buildings, this is on the right, the graph shows all of their buildings stacked together, which basically is the size of the island of Manhattan. And this, by the way, appeared in Places, so it's very exciting. This was the first. That was the reason that I could put this drawing together. So I'm grateful for that. But nonetheless, the idea is that these buildings are part of a much larger system, and the way Walmart refers to them, they call them prototypes. They don't actually really talk about them as architecture. And for them, prototypes are an instrument of Walmart's logistical system. The prototype, and it represents a nimble design approach. It's one that is not improvisational, however. So with the rest of Walmart's operations, every move is calculated only in different phases. The marketing, distribution, and replenishment demands of the stores require strict adherence to a prototypical floor plan, which is what you can see along the bottom. However, as these designs can only be completed through their instantiation in specific sites, there is room to negotiate between the particulars of location and the requirements of Walmart's logistical operations. So the prototype, in other words, provides the necessary slack within an otherwise rigid system that allows it to adapt to a range of unexpected situation while still allowing this tightly choreographed performance to take place. So what you can see along the top are three versions of this prototype. They're all a little bit different because they're each fitting into a different context, but always the floor is the same. And so there's a fixed interior configuration which is constantly being renewed, and then this crust, this blue crust around the outside of the building, that part is the part that it can be transformed. This is the point of sale, which is probably a familiar point in a store, but I think it's important. This is not just the place where you trade your money for the merchandise you've collected on your journey through the store. This is also where you exchange your consumer purchasing behavior with the company, because that's when they decide, that's how they help figure out what to put in those stores, and how they move all this stuff through the country is through a network of both single stores and distribution centers. So the red dots are the distribution centers, the blue dots are the actual stores. And I think what's, for me, telling about a map like this is that, at least in it's more evident, especially in the West and the central part of the country, where the stores actually reinscribe an already existing infrastructural system. So I think that also helps us to understand the behavior of some of these patterns, where certain paths that get laid down become reinforced and reinscribed throughout subsequent growth. And this is a drawing of a distribution center. This is one of the sites of these large switching operations. I think also, it was really exciting to see Banham on the screen. That has also been an influential way of trying to think about drawing these buildings without buildings. So this is ostensibly a drawing of a building, and yet where is the architecture in a drawing like this, which is maybe something we can talk about, but it's also, for me, something that's really fundamental about the way we think of logistical architecture. And then all of the information that's then collected when you scan your items at the store get collected in this data center, which is outside of Walmart's headquarters. And that becomes part of a feedback loop in which new orders are placed, which then triggers all of these planetary processes of production and distribution and so on. And beyond just being sites of switching and data collection, buildings also become instrumental parts of a spatial agenda for Walmart, where their collection of built forms is designed to be flexible and adaptable, which allows them, among other things, to be marshaled with particular territorial aims. So it uses its precise location capabilities to operate at these supra-legislative levels, and in doing so, imbuing architecture with a political capacity capable of creating its own borders and perhaps even undermining certain political identities. In a certain way, Walmart's logistically informed perspective is indifferent to local configurations beyond the specific demographic criteria that mesh with the retailer's expansion goals. So as a result, Walmart understands its sites as conceptually fungible conditions, decoupling in a certain sense place from location. And the maps on the screen here show Walmart's efforts to enter the market of Vermont by basically building a ring of stores around the state because they weren't allowed to build stores in the state, but they could go as close as they could to the border, and that was what they needed to get their market share. The headquarters of Walmart is actually in a kind of counterintuitive location in a certain way, a product of historical circumstances. Sam Walton, the founder, has said, in fact, quote, "We never planned on actually going into the cities. What we did instead was build our stores in a ring around the cities." So Walmart, large as it is, remains a family business of sorts. Far-flung as its networks are, it remains centrally headquartered in the somewhat remote Bentonville, Arkansas. Logistics, and it's fitting, I think, because logistics works to disaggregate all of these multiple aspects of industrial capitalism. And a closer look at Bentonville helps to understand how the consequences of that dissolution start to, the consequences of this dissolution basically start to indicate some of the things that we've just been seeing. So this, in a way, the headquarters here is neither proximate to Walmart sites of production, to its customers, to its suppliers, to any number of resources that we might typically associate with a growing urban condition. So, but even so, Walmart is ambitious, and I think that the idea that it continues to then operate at a planetary level is something that is not a surprise. But I think for me, that's a very quick trip through some of the aspects of Walmart's operations. And what I want to do in the next little bit here is maybe speculate about how we might expand outward with this. So one of the things that starts to show up then when we looked at looking at all these buildings, trying to figure out how to make sure that they can remain operationally continuous, making sure they can figure out how to find their way into resistant markets, or all of these things. All of those things have to do with protocols of calculation and management and prediction, basically. So there's this in the home office of Bentonville, the Sam Walton R&D facility. There are people trying to figure out how best to gain access to these things, or how best to optimize these things, how best to streamline that supply chain. However, they always run aground when they hit the contingencies of site and terrain and locality. And so between all that, there's this big mess of stuff that allows that to somehow get these two things to be mediated. And that's what I've been trying to think of as the logistical. So trying to talk about that more as a condition rather than simply logistics as a branch of knowledge or an area of work, but actually as a thing that we can start trying to understand. And so I have a few thoughts about what that logistical might be, or what the logistical might be. So one hypothesis is that it's topological, not typological. Topology, as you might know, comes from graph theory and mathematics. It's about the study of properties of space that can remain preserved under continuous deformation. So in a certain sense, it's about malleable relationships between elements in a system, which is famously begins with Euler's question, if you could cross these 7 bridges of Königsberg without doubling back, which basically allowed him to start mapping it in terms of nodes and edges, which then when you look at this diagram that I showed at the beginning around the process of getting goods to the port, suddenly that idea of all the arrows becomes very, very significant, because there's a whole set of things in between as those things move through space. So another important aspect of the logistical is that things, buildings, and sites all become objects of calculation and management. So the tendencies and imperatives of logistics are actively transforming buildings, landscapes, and bodies. And these transformations are legible in the spaces, the organizational forms, and the technologies they generate. In this sense, individual consumption habits form part of a complex network of exchange between people, organizations, and production systems, mediated by a host of technologies that are constantly collecting and producing data. Logistics registers a number of trajectories relevant to the urban, often reflecting what Zygmunt Bauman has identified as tendencies toward what he calls liquefaction, including, quote, the mind-boggling speed of circulation, of recycling, aging, dumping, and replacement, which brings profit today, end quote, as well as the value of what he calls traveling light as an asset of power because, quote, holding to ground is not that important if the ground can be reached and abandoned at a whim, end quote. These images of things moving frenetically through space, of holdings freezing and thawing, appearing and disappearing in accelerated ways, as if viewed through a time-lapse camera, are precisely enabled by practices of logistics. Rather than encouraging congestion, logistics pursues unencumbered movement. Rather than seeking density, logistics aspires to coverage. It is a horizontalizing and externalizing industry, not a vertical and integrating one. It does not leave things to chance. For example, the unplanned urban encounter is not accommodated in logistics regimes, but relies on calculation to reduce risk. Similarly, logistics planners prefer to anticipate future concerns rather than react to them, but when the unexpected occurs, the nimbleness of the industry allows it to quickly make adjustments. Instead of the friction of an earlier era in which things rubbed up against each other along their way, and the narrow streets of Manhattan, for example, logistics tries to lubricate movement as much as possible. In the retail sector, this is especially true because static merchandise is literally a frozen asset. In this sense, the ideal condition for a retail logistics network is to have all of its merchandise suspended in a constant state of circulation. A humming network of movement with no backups, no bottlenecks, and no accumulation of storage. So, information can move incredibly fast, but because objects must still be moved physically, the process of making such goods available are measured in terms both tangible and ethereal, spatial and temporal, in terms of weight and velocity, but also in terms of anticipation and risk, calculation and information, concreteness and abstraction. And I think this is an image from a journal called Army Logistician, which is, I think, telling for the way that it conflates the enclosure of this space, which is the architecture, ostensibly with the merchandise itself, and the only out-of-place thing here is the human driving the forklift. Or in the space of, this is a diagram showing some of the picking technology used to enable these logistical systems. So as humans become incredibly enrolled and entangled in these processes, incidentally also apparently blinded and amputated by the process. And then just as logistics tries to eliminate space through the optimization of these processes, it also has to encumber it more and more and more. So this is an image of an Amazon, they call them fulfillment centers. But this is, like, for me, a staggering image because it's almost like looking back at an image from the 19th century of an abundance of industrial accumulation. And this is now the next level of Amazon's organization, which is this acquisition of this technology. Probably you have seen it, called Kiva. What it is are these series of robotic drive units that move merchandise around and bring it to people instead of having to send people out into these vast warehouses. So what's fascinating about that is because it's not a hierarchical organizational system, the goods can be anywhere in the space, and so the elements that are more popular need to be shipped out faster, so those things are closer. And so what you see in the bottom, in a certain way, is a map of consumer desire. So basically, that map is what we like, but we can't read it because it's not designed for us. It's designed for the elements reading the barcodes. So I wanted to end, there's one more point, if I could quickly end with this distinction between a way that the protocols of calculation are overlaid onto the physical and the political. So on the left, a familiar, and this I think was even apparent in the map that we saw at the very beginning of election results. So on the left, the political boundaries of the United States. On the right, a kind of simulation model of the topography of the state. So you could call that terrain on the right, and on the left, territory, for example. But often those things are at odds with each other in a certain sense. Occasionally there have been proposals for allowing the topographic and the political to intersect. This is a proposal from the 1930s to manage territory. But through some of the logistical imagination, we start to see new metrics that start to be overlaid. In this case, it's about where people are shopping. And I think and then on the right, this is a map of Walmart showing their distribution areas. And I think for me, what's telling about this is that we start to see the evidence of this logistical order taking shape. So if on the left is the alignment of the political and the topographic, on the right, this overlay of optimization and infrastructural availability becomes part of that story. So I guess what I've been thinking about then is, if we can talk about urbanity, can we also talk about logisticality and what its features would be, or can we even start developing a theory of logisticalism. If logistics tends to use loose, underspecified strategies like topological flexibility or low-definition prototypes to produce this overspecified version of the world, what do we do with that? Is that, I mean, they're trying to define this thing using techniques of kind of Slack and things like that to create this incredibly overspecified space. Are there opportunities to engage that? And I think just as a kind of parable, it's possibly a slightly fraught parable, but I think for me, infrastructures and the logistical processes they support are generally underspecified systems capable of being read, used, and appropriated in a range of ways. For example, before 1967 in Sweden, motorists used the left lane, as in England. To many, this condition raised a number of regulatory safety and commercial concerns. A government resolution initiated the process, and after gradually intensifying media and education campaigns, including a song and a contest and various logos and commemorative merchandise, it led up to this shift where the country suddenly, all at once, changed to the other side. So at 4:50 in the morning on September 3rd, 1967, the entire country stopped driving for 10 minutes, quietly switched lanes, waited, and then moved in the other direction. So thank you very much.
I'm tempted to jump off from the logisticality and ask how it might have ever been different with regard to the development of human settlements. If you know, cities of trade, the Roman city, if they weren't always about whether driven by militaristic or other forces, whether they weren't always created with these kinds of systems, and that the architecture grew out of and became a kind of stable embodiment of that. But let's come back to that. I want to, you know, the grouping tonight's a little bit unusual for these sessions because often we try and assemble two people who may have opposing points of view on a particular subject. And tonight, I don't think we have two people that have particularly opposing points of view, but are coming at a similar set of questions from a different disciplinary and kind of methodological point of view. So that puts me, or maybe later the audience, in the position of having to be the thorn, more of the thorn. So I tried to put my head around, I didn't bring it with me, but Neil's book that we talked about, Implosions, Explosions, has a lot of his writing, but has the writing of many, many other people who are struggling with this question. It's quite a tome. And so I tried to get through some of it in the last year off and on. And I kept coming back to something that I had been very taken by as a student, which was Raymond Williams' The Country and the City, where, if you know this book, was a very famous, influential book. He worked through the history of poetry and literature to tease out through a kind of aesthetic and other means, the meanings and understandings, particularly in the English context, of cities and the countryside, to show that the over-romanticization of the countryside and the idea that it was simple was wrong, and that in some ways the demonization of the city or the characterization of the city, especially coming out of the Industrial Revolution, wasn't also quite right. But in the end, he held to the concept that conceptually, maintaining the differences between these two things were extremely valuable as a conceptual tool. So I want to kind of start there and ask, well, let me start with you, Neil. There's a way in which, and I know you've had this kind of question before, there's a way in which your characterization can be seen as a little bit totalizing, and a smoothing out, if you will, of the differences between the kinds of urbanization and settlements that exist. And some might say that isn't necessarily useful for finding moments of, let's say, political agency.
Yeah, so let's come back to Williams a little later on. But in terms of the question of totalization, I do get that a lot. And so let me try to be really clear about this. So first of all, the argument that I'm making is that the categories that we currently use as a kind of meta-geographical or epistemological framework within which to pose all kinds of questions about the specificity of urbanization processes, those categories are the totalizing ones. So in other words, the frame that I tried to outline in terms of the epistemology of the bounded city, the city as a singularity, the city as a settlement type, which is simply being filled with population, which is then replicated across the world. From my point of view, that is an incredibly totalizing and blunt instrument for analyzing the spatial, environmental, social, logistical transformations of our world. So the first cut of the work that I and my colleagues are doing is to try to bring into relief an epistemological set of assumptions that are widely presupposed even among analysts whose goal is to analyze specific forms of urbanization in different parts of the world. So in other words, using a totalizing framework and then filling it in with descriptive particularities that correspond to different regional urbanization processes. So that's our starting point, and then what we're trying to do is to say, okay, what if we put that framework aside and introduce an idea of the urban fabric as a whole, as a totalizing process, which is internally being differentiated, which is then a starting point, we would argue, and by we in this case I mean myself and Christian Schmidt, with whom I'm working a lot on this stuff. We would use that kind of a framework as a starting point for reposing the question of generality versus specificity. So the question of specificity remains fundamental, but we need to get clear about what sort of epistemological framework we're going to use in order to grapple with that question. And in a certain kind of way, that brings us back to Raymond Williams. Like, we can maybe go further with that, but just maybe a word or two on it. I mean, the Williams concept is actually quite dialectical. So country and city are not static spatial terms. They're cultural forms that are constantly being contested and reorganized and rescaled. I mean, the last chapter of The Country and the City is basically about the world scale of imperialism as a scale on which territorial inequality and spatial differentiation are occurring. And so I think the dialectical kind of cultural anthropology that Williams is advocating is methodologically quite relevant to the sort of work that we're doing, although one might need other categories of spatial difference now beyond the dualism between the country and the city that he's focused on given his particular literary analytic.
So what you're saying then is that if you take his formulation as you're saying, he was saying there was much more of an interplay between those two conditions than was generally understood. But you begin to develop a much more detailed and diversified idea of kinds of settlements that not are just in a gradient between the country and the city, but are like these logistical environments, a whole sorts of formations that were not even imagined, let's say, in England
Exactly.
up until the late 20th century.
Exactly. I mean, in a certain kind of way, one way to read Williams on this question is that the city and the country are not settlement types at all. They're discursive terms that emerge and get contested and reconstituted within a force field of global capitalist development, the struggle over enclosure of land and property at various spatial scales, and ongoing processes of what someone like David Harvey today would call accumulation by dispossession. So the city and the country are the discursive terms within which some of those spatial contestations occur, but they don't refer to static fixed settlement types, and they don't refer to singularities. I mean, it's a much more dialectical approach, which I think we can actually learn quite a bit from, also in terms of understanding the categories of practice, not just country and the city, but other categories of practice that are used by large corporations, by planners, designers, architects, by politicians, by others in everyday life who are trying to influence and transform the built and unbuilt environments that are kind of interconnected through these multiscalar processes.
So what you're implying you're saying in what a kind of blind spot that's produced by an overconcentration on whatever you call it, a global city or the urban age, is that, of course there are winners and losers, and there is a kind of a massive migration of power and interest and human capacity. And that needs to be understood. And what's interesting about what you're doing, Jesse, is that your work actually, because the case study in particular of Walmart is such a window into that in the way that it has literally, not, as you say, hollowed out actually major cities because they were resistant to the Walmart model, but mostly the smaller, let's say, towns and settlements that were linked with the countryside. So there are winners and losers in the Walmart model, and so this brings me back to, I think, the question of your work, and really Neil's as well, which comes down to questions of agency. Having sort of laid plain what Walmart does beyond what we all understood, that they were putting certain scales of retail industry and certain formations of them out of business, right? And those weren't always mom and pop stores. They had their own history of a larger business model, but you're showing it as a kind of world system. But now, having done that, and actually I know you're at the point where you're kind of bringing some of that work to a close, the question of, as a planner, as an architect, what do we do with what we learn from that system of world domination, if I may put it so bluntly?
Well, I mean, I liked the, I mean, the these things you laid out about understanding and representation and action. So I think that, I mean, for me, the process of still just trying to visualize the process, I think, contributes to then a great understanding of how these things are actually working. And so I think for me, one of the things that we start doing is finding the sites of like encryption. So for me, I think it was interesting that you used the phrase deciphering. I mean, I think for me, a lot of it is about trying to continue to decode the landscapes that we're inhabiting, and to try to find ways that we can continue to work on understanding these illegible systems, but trying to also figure out ways to engage them. I mean, one way I think about this in terms of like where this is going is thinking of, like, I've been trying to find versions of features, and one that helped to kind of understand the like end game of logistics in a certain sense. And so there's the, like, I don't know if you know these stories, maybe there's one, E.M. Forster is famous, The Machine Stops, where everyone basically enabled by a like hyper logistical world lives in their own bubble and doesn't ever see anyone, or and then it's like basically deifies logistics. It becomes the thing they worship because it allows them to live a life of the mind, and in a certain way that's actually like a really nice scenario if you read it from a certain point of view, that it's basically like labor is removed, nothing is externalized, it's all automated. The other version is something like Kipling's With the Night Mail, where everyone just like goes about living their lives as long as they don't screw around or like interfere with the postal system, which has become this like global totalitarian organization. And so, I mean, I guess like for me, it's a question, I think your question of values comes back to the beginning, because I think for me, this feeds back onto how we also think about our own relationships to these things. So the choices that we're, and I mean, I don't know, that it gets a little bit tricky for me. So then sometimes I try to think, well, maybe it's about where architecture can start to take on other kinds of ways of thinking. So maybe by avoiding the singularity of the building, in the same way that you're talking about avoiding the singularity of the city, we can also start finding an expanded set of tools. And that's maybe for me where like the prototype, for example, is an exciting idea, because it's not about depending on a single object, but actually trying to think about giving up a little bit of control in order to maybe engage larger kinds of systems.
So maybe a couple observations about the way that our work connects, and then a question for Jesse. So I was thinking about, so there's an important distinction that economic geographers Michael Storper and Richard Walker make between geographical industrialization and territorial development, and it actually connects up with what we're doing. In a certain way, Jesse is looking at geographical industrialization in the sense that his starting point is to look at the firm, in this case large-scale corporations like Walmart, and then look at how that firm articulates to a variety of different territorial geographies across a very big landscape. But the unit of analysis for that approach is the firm, and then territory is a kind of broader set of locational possibilities and architectural transformations, which Jesse very productively brings in. So that's geographic industrialization. Territorial development starts by looking at the territory and looks at the interactions between firms, workers, states, social movements in the production of territorial configuration. And I think both of us are interested in both, but the kinds of arguments that I'm developing are much more framed around territorial development and critiquing inherited ways in terms of urban-rural concepts and so forth for thinking about the current formation of planetary territorial development. Whereas I think Jesse's starting point is the firm. And so they articulate, but those are two kind of complementary starting points. And one question that I would just like to throw into the mix, I mean, I likewise think that logistics are an essential dimension of contemporary global urbanization, contemporary global spatial transformation. As you may remember, that was one of my 3 dimensions of urbanization. So intensity of land use, connectivity, which is basically another way of saying logistics, and then socio-environmental metabolism. So I'm very sympathetic to that because it gets us outside of this morphological fetish. But part of what I'm wondering about, and I wonder if you could speak to, is what's the specificity of Walmart's relation to that broader field of logistics relative to the way that other large-scale corporations might relate to logistics? So for example, I put some examples up related to the resource economy that Richard also referred to, which are also, of course, very much concerned about and invested in logistics. So all those pipelines from the tar sands back to the cities involve a particular relationship to logistics and therefore also a relationship to territory, but they have a different kind of commodity. It's a primary commodity with its own particular qualities and its own particular structure of consumption. Whereas Walmart is obviously sourcing products from all around the world, and its marketing strategy, its locational strategy, is more connected to the location of consumers. So it seems to me there is a broad, I mean, those are 2 examples, there's a broad set of geographies related to the logistics, and your work is opening up, you know, through these deep case studies of large corporations of a particular kind, one way of studying that. But does the work, I guess my question is, in what ways does the work have broader methodological or political implications for how to think about the way other kinds of corporations relate to this field of the logistical?
Well, I mean, maybe one way to answer it initially is to just kind of start identifying the different kinds of logistics. And I think for me, that's where like these kind of like gestures initially toward trying to think of it as a condition have to do then with like the subsequent step, which would be to figure out like what's going on in that condition. So, and maybe one way to start is through trying to understand different, like more specific behaviors. So one distinction would be like the directionality maybe. So pushing model versus a pulling model. So for example, the e-commerce model where goods are asked for via personal choice online, and then they're brought to you versus the warehouse model, which is increasingly becoming maybe a relic or something, but still the idea that there's a wholesale availability of something and then you go there. And so I think thinking about that then relative to like the tar sands or something like that, or the way that like resources are moving, I mean, is that a pushing or pulling model? And I think that obviously there's a lot more complexity to these kinds of things. But
what's interesting, you know, Neil, you showed that mapping exercise where you wanted to show the inverse of the spike and what the spike feeds on. I like the one sequence in your description of your project where you talked about how logistics seeks a lack of friction, right, and smoothness, and that's why horizontal morphologies are preferable because they don't introduce friction. So one of my questions then is, isn't some of the work you're talking about, doesn't it require, in a sense, understanding and mapping where that friction might occur? And isn't that friction related to what we conceptually or ideologically like to think of as an important form of urbanity, which is the interruption of the smooth logistics? Because you know, when our lives are made too mechanical, it's deadening, right? And you're made subject to various kinds of regimes, and the whole promise of the kind of classical discussion of the city and sociology is a kind of space of liberation, right? Where various kinds of frictions allow you to change lanes, right? And interrupt or disrupt flows of power. So isn't that a project? What disrupts Walmart?
Regulation tends to do it. And I think one thing that was interesting about those gaps in your map, the recesses, I would, at least I know better the American West is where this is the site of increasingly less regulation. And so that relationship, that other dialectic between regulation and deregulation is an interesting one in the kind of historic version of the city, where it would be on one hand liberating, but it's also an intense site of government in a certain sense. So the idea of like, let's say, structure or something like that. So I wonder, for me, I think that's the confrontation with regulation is something that always is what produces friction in these logistical systems. So that's the Vermont story, for example. That was when Howard Dean was the governor of Vermont. He flew even to Bentonville on like a kind of diplomatic mission to negotiate with David Glass to say, we're not against you, but we're against where you locate, and so can we negotiate? And Walmart was trying to do all of those things within the state, the highly regulated, controlled state. But that's when then the sort of back of house thing, the unregulated other aspects where they could find their like end arounds through it. So I think that for me, that another frontier of that would be trying to understand the way that these regulations start to play out, and then how that starts working more globally. Because I think that's where.
But you've written about this, Neil, that the period prior to the current one, there was, of course, a kind of nation state or a state apparatus to produce this kind of to manage urbanization, and that has been in some ways dismantled, and nothing replaces that.
Yeah, so the question of political regulation has to be front and center. I've been doing my deconstruction of these categories and suggesting alternatives, and the whole time until now haven't broached the topic. But of course, all of these formations of urbanization, prior to the current one and in the current one, are thoroughly mediated, indeed, through political institutions and political strategies. Urbanization itself is arguably a political strategy. So in my earlier work, one of the issues that I was interested in is the ways in which I was looking mainly at Western Europe, but there are different versions of this in other parts of the world system, that national states during the Fordist Keynesian developmentalist period were mobilizing different kinds of projects of spatial equalization. The notion was that if you have a large urban-rural divide or other forms of spatial inequality within a national economy, it's economically dysfunctional. So particularly in the Western European context, there were projects essentially to promote generalized urbanization on a national scale. So in other words, by industrializing the periphery, it was viewed not so much as a way to achieve social justice, but as a way to preserve or promote macroeconomic stability. So a kind of spatial Keynesianism, and there are different versions of that in the post-colonial world as well, and as well as in the North American context, in the US American context, there are different versions of that. So in the context of the long 1980s, so basically the breakdown of the Fordist Keynesian order in the 1970s up through the collapse of state socialism in the early 1990s, that particular project of spatial equalization at a national scale has been systematically abandoned. I don't know if nothing replaces it, because what I think we have right now, at the risk of generalizing too broadly, but just as a way to open up the debate, is a kind of commitment to global neoliberalism, in which markets are thought to provide the solution to different kinds of regulatory problems, and the formation of planetary urbanization that we've been studying. For example, the increasing enclosure and commodification of these erstwhile wilderness zones, for example, is very much connected to new market-friendly or market-oriented regulatory arrangements that permit the extension of capital investment, commodification, and so forth, enclosure of land in zones that were previously more or less insulated from those kinds of large-scale infrastructural investments. So from my point,
China to Africa or
Latin America, et cetera.
Yeah.
So there's a whole, this is a longer conversation, but there's a whole set of very large-scale infrastructural investments and projects in most of the continents of the world that are about essentially creating a kind of infrastructural and logistical infrastructure, infrastructure and a spatial infrastructure for a new wave of global capitalism. So that's a regulatory project. It's a contradictory one, it's a polarizing one, it's an environmentally and socially destructive one, but it's not the absence of regulation from my point of view.
Just on that, I mean, one thing that struck me during the presentation also about the question of the singularity of the city relative to what you're describing is how that notion becomes so conveniently mobilized to do all sorts of things, like presented as a product that can be built in, like the smart city collection of things around the world that we're starting to see, or the idea that these free trade zones or zones become labeled as cities or something like that as a way to allow these funny pockets of deregulation to be politically palatable, for example.
Exactly. Let's take a few questions from the audience, and what we're going to do is, because we're hitting the wall of time, is I'd like to maybe take a few questions one after the other, and see if there's some themes that build up, and then allow our guests to, where possible, respond. So there are some mics on your right and left. Kelly?
I have a question that actually ties all three of you together, starting first with Richard's introduction of the whole notion of urbanism to begin with. So the notion that urbanism is the act of reading the city and then intervening in the city, which I think is really important, that we don't lose sight of the fact that we do have to intervene, especially more and more as we go on, that we're getting last chance, I think, to intervene in the city as more professions take our role intervening, and we get marginalized as others take our profession in their hands, engineers, developers, etc. So I think it's really important that we stand up for intervening. And so I direct this to both of you, knowing that, Neil, you do have a urban theory lab, so it's not maybe meant to intervene. But still, I think your role is important as forming urbanists, forming people who should intervene. So my question is maybe a little bit a nasty one, but I will ask it anyways. Because I wonder in this notion of putting forth planetary urbanism, if it's also not a little bit neo-colonial, in the sense that saying there hasn't been a lot of looking at the whole notion of the city and the urban as separate entities by others before, because I think there has been, by people looking in other parts of the world, studying urbanism from non-Western, non-European perspectives. A very well-known geographer working out of UPC, University of British Columbia, named Terry McGee, of course came up with the term Desakota. Desa meaning village, Kota meaning city, talking that in Asian countries, these two were always living very much side by side. The Asian city, there were always the two almost embedded in one another. There was always a village in the city, and there was always cities in the villages, because they had a mode of production that was very different because of rice paddy, etc. So I think it's really important to recognize that the Western, now neoliberal point of view hasn't always been there, and there have been very different ways of thinking about the urban and the rural that still persist, and I think are important ways to understand a planetary urbanization from millennium ago. And then also a little bit to Jesse. For me, and this also would go back also to Neil. For me, of course, we know that for decades now, we've been in an age of mapping. We are in the digital world. Maps, I think both of the maps that have come out of your work are incredibly beautiful. We're in an age of beautiful maps, and every school and every one of us wants to have more beautiful maps. But to a certain degree, you start to wonder, so what? I think they become almost an alibi to not design. And so after a while, what do we need them for anymore? What is the agency of mapping? Of course, we know some beautiful essays entitled The Agency of Mapping, but have we lost sight of that when we're talking about urbanism, as the way Richard has, and many others, urbanists, have defined it? Because I do think we have to make sure we act and intervene. So it's...
Well, we got a number of questions there, so I think maybe we have it would be good to respond. Anyone want to start?
I'll be happy to.
I have a simple answer. So,
Well, do you want to start?
I think your question or your proposition that the agency of particular disciplines and particular professions in the spaces we're talking about has become more and more limited, or maybe never existed, accounts for maybe the reason why architects and certain kinds of urbanists have concentrated so much on the agglomerated city, where they have, in a sense, a community, if you will, or a market for what they do, and especially for cities that have matured historically and that have an investment in a kind of a cultural infrastructure. That is where architects operate. We have many people on our faculty. In fact, I don't know if you know this, Neil, but like a third of the people that are working on in the lab are students here.
Yeah, I do.
That we have faculty that have been taking on these other territories as design projects, one of them sitting in the front row. And the question is always, well, will you ever get to work there as an architect or someone who designs as opposed to being some huge engineering firm, right? So I think it's a matter sometimes of expediency and practicality from a professional point of view.
So just a few remarks. So first of all, let me be clear about one thing on a very general level. Like, I definitely, in making some of the broad generalizations that I'm making about the history of urban theory, in no way whatsoever do I dismiss the fundamental significance of, the history of urban theory, whether in the West or whether in the non-West. And a lot of what we've been doing and what I've been doing, which is an incredibly interesting thing to do, I'm finding, is excavating a lot of classic works of urban theory from the 19th century all the way up through the modernist period, up through the 1970s, Marxism, feminism, and so forth, from the point of view of the particular intellectual, epistemological, and political agendas that we have in our work now. And it is actually, I won't go into it now because we're almost out of time, but it's really been a fascinating thing, and that the standpoint that we have now in relation to contemporary, for example, environmental concerns, or contemporary concerns about the enclosure of the rural, in quotation marks, it opens up very interesting perspectives from which to critically reappropriate inherited literatures. In terms of the specific point about Terry McGee and the Desakota, 100% agreement. In fact, we included that chapter in Implosions, Explosions. So the book Implosions, Explosions, we selected a few texts that we consider classics, so a bit of Lefebvre, a bit of Terry McGee, some work of David Harvey, others, as a way to kind of critically animate the work that we're doing right now. And the notion of Desakota is a very, very relevant concept around the world right now, because what Terry McGee argued with that concept is he breaks out of a settlement-spaced, or as he puts it, city-centered or city-dominant concept of the urban in order to focus on the flow of populations across the erstwhile urban-rural divide. The whole thing is a critique of the urban-rural divide. And in our lab, actually, we have a student right now who's working on the Ganges Plain, which is arguably one of the biggest Desakota regions in the world, which is very tightly connected to the rail infrastructure of India, which allows migrant workers to move seasonally across the so-called urban-rural nexus. So the agrarian and the industrial are intermeshed in ways that the Indian Census Bureau's categories don't enable us to appreciate. And that kind of an argument would apply in parts of Southeast Asia, in parts of China as well. So I'm very sympathetic to that, and that's a great example of a concept which it was developed, I think, in the 80s and into the 90s, and it kind of was on the back burner, and I see it kind of coming back into play in the context of these concerns. One other remark, if I may. So the point that you make, which I think is a very appropriate point, that we also need to design, we also need to intervene. So the beautiful maps are great, but what's the point? So that's something I've been thinking about a lot because I work now in a design school, which is a relatively recent thing for me, having taught in a sociology department for a long time before that. And secondly, I teach urban theory in a design school. So the argument that I would make, it may not satisfy you, but it's something I feel very strongly about, is that the work of interpretation, within which I include the work of visualization, is an absolutely fundamental dimension of practice, of intervention. Practice and intervention in any realm, whether in the realm of large-scale corporations, in the realm of political discourse, in the realm of social movements, it always presupposes these broader meta-narratives, and visualization is very frequently a part of those meta-narratives. So the work of theory, from my point of view, in the context of design, the built environment, is to provide the basis for reflexively and critically interrogating those meta-narratives, many of which, including in their visual form, many of which are deeply misleading and obfuscatory and contribute to the reproduction of systems of power, exclusion, domination, environmental destruction. So I don't think of these visualization critiques and the critique of theoretical meta-narratives as separate from the realm of practice at all. It's a dimension of the process in which we develop new capacities to intervene.
Jesse, anything you want to add to that?
Sure, well, sure. I mean, I think these are the questions that I wake up every day asking. Well, how do I, what is this all for? And I do think that that not in that sense, but I finished the drawing. I have to finish the drawing because I need to get it into the publisher. But then what is it doing? And I think for me, the ubiquity that you're identifying is actually an exciting thing if you think about other, if we could call this a kind of media condition or something like that. If you think about other forms of media that were vested with an authority objectively, like photography or something, and now we discover that those images don't have authority in the same way that they might have in the past, and that's actually really liberating because we can start conjuring other worlds with them. I mean, for me, that's one of the things that mapping can do, because now that if we start undermining its authority and messing with that, that's a way actually to communicate or help enable other kinds of political imagination or something. So for me, the map is a powerful tool for actually presenting alternatives, not just through understanding what's going on. So I think that there's a lot of still space for thinking of them in those terms, that actually not to just fetishize them, but actually to try to think about how they can help bring in other audiences to the discussion.
A couple of years ago, we had Charles Blow here, who's a columnist at the New York Times, but he started out as the creative director in developing the visualization program at the New York Times, and then went to National Geographic. And he told a very interesting story about how he started out when he was illustrating the news, so to speak, in being invested in explaining complexity to the public, and having these visualizations explain in a way ambiguous things around, let's say, the Iraq War, and that he had come full circle and now becoming someone who writes editorials and writes from a very more subjective point of view, to using visualizations to say something very singular and very blunt and seemingly very objective. So I think one of the things is as this work unfolds, is there are different audiences and different, in a sense, kinds of agency for the visualizations we're talking about. Even though we're going over, I'm gonna take one more question because, Robert Levitt has the mic.
Do I get to ask the question?
What?
Do I get to ask the question?
I guess having the mic gives you that.
I mean, it's a question along the lines of Kelly's commentary, but I was struck by what struck me was the categorical difference between those visualizations that tried to map systems or flows, global flows, and the political map. The political map was a map of conflict and difference, and it actually is a map that undermines totalization. And it seems that it's illustrative in some way of how politics and politics on the one hand and optimization, which is what all the other maps are about, are at odds with each other. Thank goodness, it seems to me. So I just wonder how in either of your schema, your studies will accommodate what is essentially a categorical difference and different set of commitments that the political map illustrates, and perhaps to my mind, even what architecture and city making are related to, which strike me as perhaps more related to political acts rather than to optimizing systems.
Yeah, great question. Fantastic question. Maybe I'll take a quick stab at it. For me, it's an unanswerable and fundamental question. And just as a way of engaging with it, what I would say is that the mapping work that we've done in the Urban Theory Lab to date has been mapping planetary urbanization at different scales and different sites from the point of view of capital. So it's a parallel, I think, in that way to Jesse's work, in that he's mapping the sort of capitalist logistical fantasy. And what I would love to do in the future, and it's going to require a lot of creativity and methodological experimentation, is try to find ways to generate counter maps, as it were, to the ones that we've produced, mapping planetary urbanization from the point of view, for example, of struggles over the right to the city, the right to territory, the right to space, the right to environmentally sane management of planetary resources, those kinds of things. A big theme in our work, which I didn't emphasize as much in this discussion today, but which is hopefully still percolating a little bit, is enclosure. I think of the capitalist form of urbanization as a process of enclosure in which people are dispossessed from access to non-commodified means of social reproduction. So enclosure is one side of a dialectic. The other side is the commons, or what some theorists call commoning. So the appropriation, the ongoing struggle to appropriate and reappropriate the commons for social purposes, for collective social management and social empowerment. So how can you start to remap some of the spaces that we've been mapping in a pretty grim way from the point of view of those struggles? And that's hopefully a future project. But I take the point, I mean, you didn't put it this polemically, but I think it wouldn't be unfair to do so, that to the degree that we're mapping this whole thing from the point of view of power, domination, the legibility, what James Scott would call the legibility project of capital, it's a pretty ideological map. So one ideological representation replaces a different one. We're very sensitive to that problem. If anyone has a solution, please let me know. We have to struggle reflexively with the problem, as part of my argument.
Thank you.